Bishop Fulton J. Sheen was invited to speak at Town Hall in Philadelphia. Though he was unfamiliar with the city and was advised to stay at his hotel and wait for someone to take him to Town Hall, Bishop Sheen decided he could find his way from his hotel to the Town Hall on his own. However, he became terribly lost. Seeing a group of young people, he inquired if they could give him directions to his destination. One of the kids asked him, "What are you going to do there?" Bishop Sheen replied, "I am going to give a lecture." "About what?" asked the youth. "On how to get to heaven. Would you like to come along?" "Are you kidding?" retorted the youth. "You don't even know how to get to town hall." The account of Bishop Sheen is an example of the similar trouble we get ourselves into when we attempt to do things our own way. In our gospel reading, Peter was confronted with a similar type of problem as he stood on the mountaintop with Jesus and witnessed Jesus' transformation. Whereas the other disciples who were with him were shocked and filled with awe, Peter's suggestion to build 3 booths suggests that he was eager to do his own thing, instead of observing what God was doing through Jesus to fulfill a ministry of love which Jesus had repeatedly revealed to his disciples. A biblical commentator suggests that Peter's desire to build the booths was caused by his misunderstanding of what Jesus' presence meant as it regarded the Messianic age. The Messianic age was viewed as the fulfillment of God's promise to live in our midst and bring justice and mercy to the world. But there were different views of how this would occur. Some believed God would enter our world peacefully as directed through the prophecies of new prophets, or that God would appear with Elijah's return. Others, as they understood Amos's vision for God's entry into the world, believed that Amos described the age of the Messiah, beginning with warriors of God who would rise to power through a violent overthrow of the Roman presence in Israel. In Amos 9, when the prophet declared that the Messianic age would bring to fruition the rise of the booth of David and be rebuilt as in the days of old. Some interpreted this phrase, booths of David, as the temporary dwellings that were used by King David's army prior to launching a successful war campaign. If Peter fell in this later camp of thought, then it's possible that he believed he was a soldier preparing to launch an attack on the Gentiles and Israel's enemies. With this frame of thought, it's likely that he believed that building these booths for Moses, Elijah, and Jesus would create a base of operations from which they would wage a war against Israel's enemies. Jesus' response to Peter's statement hints that this was precisely Peter's line of thinking, as he wanted to do his own thing, no matter how well-intentioned it was, as he thought it would be on Jesus' behalf. However, this scene reveals that Peter was not waiting silently for Jesus' instructions to lead the way, which is typical behavior for Peter. Based on Mark's gospel, Peter constantly was attempting to do things his own way and often struggled to remain silent when it was important to observe silence and learn from Jesus. Though, as one author writes, silence is unsettling to most people, not just Peter. It is difficult for some to stand around in the midst of other people with no one speaking. Silence is typically practiced when we're in the presence of loved ones or when we are with people we trust. Like when we're walking on a beach with a loved one or taking a long car ride with them or watching the sun rise or the sun set. It's easy at those times to sit in silence with loved ones. But there's a weight of needing to act or break the uncomfortable silence when we're sitting with strangers. I recall when I was enrolled in seminary and was taking a clinical pastoral education unit at a large hospital in Indiana where I served as a student chaplain. At one of our class discussions, some of the student chaplains remarked that their greatest challenge was allowing silence to be part of their pastoral care. It felt uncomfortable, unnatural, and honestly scary. Silence incorporates stillness, and keeping still involves taking a risk to be open to the family in need, as well as being open to God's voice. Typically, we avoid the silence by being busy with our hands and with our minds or with our mouths when we talk or even as we move about. Some persons will go out of their way just to avoid being stuck in silence. Still, God yearns for us to embrace the silence by inviting us to be still and know that God is God. This counsel from Isaiah encourages us to find silence with God where we discover joy and peace. Surely it takes great courage and risk to enter silence with God. Yet our silence allows God to live into us, and silence allows us to relinquish control so that God can guide our lives in love through Jesus. In silence, we have an open space in which we encounter God. And though we often think of silence as the absence of noise, on the contrary, Robert Cardinal Sarah writes in his book, The Power of Silence, that the silence of God is the simple and quiet expression of God's being, the eternal movement of the persons of the Trinity and their relations. The silence of God is a form of speech, which defies logic. Many assume that when God is silent, we're being ignored, which is a prevalent thought during this pandemic. As the world suffers, it seems God is silent, as if ignoring our problem. And in the book of Job, this was Job's complaint against God as he suffered. Job had lost his children and his house. Job had lost his health, and he was miserable. Eventually, after launching into a long tirade against God, there was a moment where Job just sat in silence. It was during that moment of silence he discovered God's presence. Job realized that it was in the silence that God had been communicating to him all along. Job just wasn't listening. Job declares that God can do all things, and God dealt with great things that I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I cannot know. These were the lessons that Jesus attempted to teach when he would sit in silence or go off into the hills to pray. Jesus recognized the importance of silence. And this becomes even more evident when he was arrested and hauled in front of the Sanhedrin and later Pilate to be questioned. Jesus adopted silence as he gave no response to their questions. Surely he wanted to explain his beliefs and his actions, yet Jesus remained silent. For Jesus, he recognized that God remained with him, and by not speaking, Jesus allowed God to do all the talking. Through Jesus, God was able to proclaim to the world that even when we are sinful, we are surrounded by divine love. Though Jesus remained silent, God was able to declare all around the globe that we belong to God. And as difficult as it probably was for God, the silence of that moment spoke louder and clearer than any spoken word from the clouds or words uttered by mere mortals. And today, as we gather this morning, we are encouraged to discover the importance of silence. Even during this global pandemic in which we ponder why God has remained silent, we discover that we need to choose silence so we can hear God speak. Instead of worrying and asking, when will we get back to normal? We're invited to discover God's presence in the silence. We're invited to discover the healing that happens in the silence and to discover the healing that happens for our minds, healing for our bodies, and healing for our communities. Recently, some photos were shared with me from a friend who lives in Scotland. The photos had been taken of downtown London where elk and other wild animals had migrated into the city. It is believed that since cars are not being operated and noisy city events have been silenced, and people are mostly remaining indoors due to COVID, animals have begun returning to the city. Along with these photos were photos of dolphin pods playing in the harbors around Europe as well, areas that had not seen dolphins in decades. the world in silence seems to be healing. Perhaps if we discovered silence with God, then we too would heal while discovering God is speaking right now in the uncomfortable, in the disturbing silence. Through silence, we find transformation, just as Jesus was transfigured on the mountaintop. Choosing to wait in silence reveals our trust in God, and it's through silence we would experience the glory of the living Lord. In silence, we would experience God in a dramatic way, and in silence, we would allow God to be in control of our lives. As we enter this season of Lent on Wednesday night and prepare for Easter, we are encouraged to discover silence so we can begin to faithfully listen to God. When we are overburdened by the chaos of the world and by our anxieties, God invites us to discover silence to receive mercy. Strengthened by God, we are free to live in the joy and peace of Christ, who transforms our lives.